Hey everyone, welcome back to Genesis 15. We're finishing up a passage on the Abrahamic covenant. We started this passage with God's assurance of protection and then shifted right away to Abram's concern about actually having seed and descendants as part of God's earlier promise to him. And so the whole chapter has been focused on reassuring Abram of God's faithfulness to deliver on that promise. So in this particular iteration of the Abrahamic covenant, there's no stress at all on there being any stipulations or requirements, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any in the Abrahamic covenant itself. All these different iterations of the Abrahamic covenant we should see as giving more facets about the same thing. This happened in the ancient Near East as well. You can check out Tony Shetter's dissertation, and part of the central issue there is that we have texts from Al-Alaq where it's the exact same covenant is being discussed or described, and in one of those passages it talks about stipulations and requirements, and in the other one it doesn't, and it has to do with what is the purpose of each of those documents. The purpose of this chapter is not to be spelling out stipulations. They are implied as we hear about the judgment that the Lord is going to bring on other nations, but they're certainly not stressed in this particular passage. So God has made promises to Abram. We've had a covenant ceremony, and this paragraph is going to wrap it up, actually referring to a covenant. So we start with Vayihi, common way to start a paragraph, and then we have Hashemesh Ba'ah. So last time we had Vayihi, and then we had Hashemesh Lavo. So the sun was going to enter the sea, the earth, to go around. And so it was not yet sunset. Here we have Ba'ah, and we have, let's ask the question, do we have a 3FS participle, or do we have a 3FS perfect, and how would we know the difference? Because the root is bo, and the second radical has dropped out because second vav, second yod roots do that. And so we get a kametz under the first radical, and that's how it's going to be both for the perfect and for the participle. But the participle should be accented like a noun, and so it would be ba'ah. Here you can see that the accent mark is over the bet, so at the very least, the Masoretes have interpreted it as a perfect. It also makes sense flowing out of the previous paragraph, which was time marked as the sun was about to go down, and now the sun has gone down. The sun had set. V'alata haya, and it was dark. V'hene tanor ashan v'lapid eish. V'hene, right, grabbing our attention. So we're just starting with this background information, and then, if we're doing the movie, maybe it's going to be the light from the torch, or just the lighting that we're doing a spotlight on. And v'hene, suddenly there's a smoking pot and a flaming torch. And the syntax here is a little odd. Asher avar bein hagizarim ha'ela. So it doesn't seem like there is any verb in the main clause. The only verb here is in an asher clause. A smoking pot and a burning torch, which normally we would say, which had passed through between these pieces. The previous paragraph talked about Abram having cut up these animals that are being part of this covenant ceremony. So it seems like we need to supply a form of to be, either right back there with an A. There was a pot and a torch which passed through, but in English, when we say it that way, it seems to put the which passed through as, like almost like a present narrative kind of thing. Our other option for putting in a form of to be would be to put it in right before the bane, right before the in between these pieces. So that would be and suddenly, or and get this, or and guess what, a smoking pot and a burning torch which had passed by was in between these pieces. Or were, because it's two things. So a couple different ways to view that. And then another question then is, what's going on with our covenant ceremony? The traditional thing is to think of both the burning torch and the smoking pot as representing the Lord. And then you get a lot of descriptions like, it's just the Lord that goes in between the pieces of these animals. And so only the Lord is taking an oath, and only the Lord is putting obligations on himself, and there's none on Abram. And that doesn't have to be the way that we look at that. We could be saying, well, maybe the burning torch is representing the Lord and the smoking pot is representing Abram. So there's two things going between the pieces, and maybe the two things are representing the two parties to the covenant. And we've also already remarked on how the purpose in this presentation is all focused on reassurance of the promise that God has given to Abram about descendants. And so if there is not an emphasis on stating stipulations, that's okay. They do seem to be implied, as we mentioned before. Then we have Bayom Hahu Karat Adonai et Avram Berit Lemor. So on that day, the Lord cut or made with Abram a covenant, saying. So this kind of summarizes all these things that have gone on so far in this episode, and it comes back to the promise that Abraham questioned about at the beginning. Lazaraka natati et haaretz hazot. To your seed, which the Lord promised Abram would be your biological descendant, right? The one who comes from your body. Natati, I hereby give, a performative perfect. We could even say I have given, in the sense that I have deeded it to them, but that's different than actually letting you take possession of it. You think about closing on a house. You can sign off and you've bought it, but you don't have possession of it yet. I have given it. I have deeded it. This land to your seed. And then we get geographic description, Min Nahar Mitzrayim, and there's a text critical note on that, and the editor simply proposed that maybe that should be Menachal instead of Min Nahar. In either case, it's going to be referring to a river in Egypt. Maybe I'm speaking a little too fast there. Perhaps it doesn't have to refer to the Nile, but certainly that's how everybody takes it, from the Egyptian river, the Nile, unto the Nahar, the great Nahar, Ad HaNahar HaGadol, and then Nahar Parat. So many people read that as to say from the Nile to the Euphrates. The text critical note around Nahar Parat simply suggests that part, that label was added. That's a suggestion of the BHS editors. There's no manuscript evidence per se relating to that. And then we have a list of the peoples of the land. So we have to your descendants I will give this land, from Egypt's river to the great river, the Euphrates, Ve'et HaKeni, Ve'et HaKenizi, Ve'et HaKadmoni. So the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Kadmonite, sorry for the typo, Ve'et HaChiti, Ve'et HaPerizi, Ve'et HaRephaim. So the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, Ve'et HaEmori, and the Amorite, Ve'et HaKanaani, the Canaanite, Ve'et HaGirgashi, the Girgashite, and then another text critical note which says that we've got squiggle and Gothic G, so that's the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint have inserted Ve'et HaChivi, or they have it and we should insert it. So the Girgashite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. So if we follow that note, we would be adding and the Hivite and maybe correcting our spelling back here. Okay, so that concludes Genesis 15. Abram has been reassured of promises that God has made, and this grand plan that spans centuries has been laid out before him. It might be a little bit hard for us to understand because we're so individualistic, and this is looking at a national scale. But it's a unique thing about the biblical worldview. It's not like Egypt that has a worldview of history that is just one repeating cycle after another. In Israel's worldview, history is linear, and God has a goal, and no matter how strange it looks between here and there, God is moving history along the path toward his goal, and that goal includes, at a minimum, blessing for Abram, and blessing for all of those who bless Abram, blessing on Abram's seed, and eventually blessing through that seed for all peoples.